Ba-da-ba! Hello and welcome. Here we are at the historic Hanover Courthouse. And this place is historic because it was at the Battle of the Courthouse. This was won by the Union in the Civil War, which is what we're here to talk about today. Now, there were a lot of aspects that led up to the Civil War, but what we're going to focus on is the legislation. All of the legislation prior to the Civil War, all of the major legislation, dealt in some way with slavery, which was at the heart of the Civil War. The first thing that we'll look at is the Compromise of 1850, which was a compromise with 4 parts. 3 of these 4 parts dealt directly with slavery, and the 4th did not deal with slavery. The 4th one was that Texas would lose its border dispute with Mexico. This may have been to prevent the South from having easy access to a railway that could go across from the Atlantic and to the Pacific. But that was not very focused on slavery. The other 3 were that in Washington the slave trade would be ended, and that Maine would be admitted into the Union as a free state, which would give 2 senatorial votes to anti-slavery, the North. Now, this is important because it throws off the balance. For many, many years, the Senate had been a place that was safe for the South, because the North's population, because of its industry, had been so much larger. It had all of the votes in the House that it needed to cross over with a majority. But in the Senate, it was balanced, so they could stop things that the North was trying to send in the Senate. But this broke that. Now, the third thing that dealt with slavery in this compromise was a Fugitive Slave Act. It said that the North would have to return any slaves to the South that they knew were slaves. If a slave was running away from its master and it came by your house and it asked you for help, you had to send that property back to its owner, because that's what slaves were, property. Now, the North, after the Second Great Awakening, saw that slavery was an abomination, a sin. It was not right by God. And the South, though they may have known that it was morally wrong, at least today it's considered morally wrong, to them it was the foundation of their whole system, their economy, their livelihoods, everything that made the South thrive was in slavery. But in the North, there were many who said this is totally wrong. We're not going to follow this law. And the South saw that as very hypocritical of the North, and it infuriated them. Because earlier, when South Carolina had been hit with a heavy tariff that they nicknamed the Tariff of Abominations, they had said, we're not going to go by this tariff. It doesn't help us. We're not going to go by it. It hurts us. So, the army was sent to South Carolina, and they were threatened that if they didn't comply with this law, force would be used to make them. So this, of course, upset the North that they would have this law put in front of them, and it makes the South crazy that the North won't follow it. That's the Compromise of 1850. But what we really need to focus on are those 2 votes. Because in our next thing, the Ostend Manifesto, we will see how those votes affect America. The Ostend Manifesto was an underhanded Southern politician way of trying to obtain Cuba from Spain. They said, Spain, we will give you this ridiculous amount of money for Cuba and just Cuba. Compared to the Louisiana Purchase, it was a terrible deal. But they needed it, because now that Maine was a free state and those 2 votes went to the North, they needed a new slave state so that it could balance out and they would be able to use the Senate to block legislation. But they couldn't put it in front of the Senate anymore because the Senate would shoot it down. The North would win. And the House, like I said, was already Northern dominated. So they had to go to Spain with 3 ambassadors and try to get them to sell Cuba without ever having shown it to the North. The North, obviously, did not like that. They felt like they couldn't trust the South. They felt like they were trying to undermine the North by spending all of this national money on a place that would only benefit the South, and a place that since it was bigger than most of the states, would probably be made not into only one slave state, but 2 or maybe 3. So the North was very upset that this was an option. The South was upset at the North because this is what they needed. Cuba, much like Haiti, was already set up in a plantation style. There had been sugarcane plantations and slavery already existed there from Spain. But the South couldn't get it, and that made them angry because they needed those votes. The next thing that we're going to look at is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This act said that Kansas and Nebraska, 2 areas of the U.S., would be made into territories. And as soon as 60,000 people were in those territories, they would take a vote. This was when they declared statehood. They would take this vote on whether or not slavery would be allowed in Kansas and then in Nebraska. Now, this meant that whoever had a majority, 30,001, in those places when they took the vote, would be able to make it slave or free. But what that did was made tons of fanatics from the North and tons of fanatics from the South all flood into these states. So it took people who were religiously zealous against slavery and people who had it ingrained into their very way of life, and it put them in the same place. And I guess you can guess what happened, because it led to Bleeding Kansas. This was a series of events, violent events, in Kansas especially, that were all over the differences between North and South, slave and free. There were fights, there was bloodshed, there were riots about whether free people who wanted Kansas to be free, should have the majority, or those who wanted it to be slave would have the majority. So some people said, well, we don't need to fight, we'll just bring more people from where we came from to make it what we want. Others said, no, that's not good enough. We have to fight. We have to get rid of the people who want to make it what we don't want. So that's why they fought. But what's important to see here is that when you bring 2 groups like that together, there is hardly any chance for peace at all. And obviously, there was no peace. They fought. And what we see there is a parallel to the entire nation leading up to the Civil War. But even this small-scale Civil War was not the final thing that led to secession and the Confederacy. What brought the whole House of Cards crashing down was the presidential election of 1860. What happened in this election was that the Republican candidate, Lincoln, won because the South split into 2 different candidates, and they couldn't support either one more than Lincoln was supported. So, with a Republican president, they had lost one of their 2 ways to block votes, or block legislation. Because since Maine had broken the balance in the Senate, they lost the entire legislative branch, and all that could save them was judicial and executive. Now, they felt like they were losing the executive branch because a Republican was in charge. They were anti-slavery, but they were anti-slavery expansion. So what we have here is a miscommunication on a global scale, well, national scale. They thought that Lincoln wants to end slavery in the South. What he wanted was to end slavery's expanding into the West. But they said, well, if he's going to stop it in the West, what's going to stop him from bringing that line back and ending slavery closer and closer to its heart? So, South Carolina seceded from America. They seceded from the Union to form the Confederacy. Along with them, 10 other slave states decided that, well, we want our slavery more than anything else, and they also seceded. So here is where the Civil War began. Now, do we think the Civil War was absolutely inevitable? It's hard to say for certain, but it did happen, so I feel comfortable saying yes, the Civil War was inevitable, because it was a cultural issue, because the North and the South had been separating ever since industry came to the North. When they lost their slavery, everything changed. There's a huge divide between North and South. And fighting slavery in the South only brought that farther and farther out in front of the public. People saw that there were differences, and people saw that the more and more different they became, the less they really belonged in the same nation. And so, after a lot of dramatic events and a lot of heavy legislation, the Civil War began.